Hello, everyone. As Mike kindly introduced me, my name is Fergus Bordewich. I'm the author of Klan War, Ulysses S. Grant and the Battle to Save Reconstruction. First, let me tell you a little bit about what this book is and what it's about. Most of us today, I think it's fair to say, if we think about the Ku Klux Klan, we see it through the lens of the 20th century. Many of us, certainly myself, are old enough to remember the Klan's activities in the 1960s or even the 1950s. This book is about the first Klan, the original Klan, which was established in 1866 and was pretty much destroyed by Ulysses Grant in the early 1870s. I'll go into that in more detail, of course. But I want to distinguish the other clans just so no one's confused as I go along here. The first Klan, as I said, existed for several years from about 1866 to about 1873-74. The second Klan was founded in 1915 in Georgia, probably the only terrorist organization in history that was inspired by a film. That's the famous film Birth of a Nation, with its highly idealized, romanticized imagery of the Ku Klux Klan looking like the cavalry chasing Indians in the West, except it's Klansmen fighting, allegedly, federal occupation troops, black troops primarily in the South. That Klan imploded on itself in the 1920s from internal corruption. It wasn't prosecuted, it spread. It was a national organization, unlike the first Klan. The second Klan probably had more members even in northern and western states than it did in the South. And its focus was not entirely on African Americans, but also on Catholics, immigrants, foreigners, Jews, and other minorities. That Klan, as I said, collapsed at the end of the 1920s. The third Klan, the third iteration of the Klan, follows World War II, and it was almost entirely a reaction to the civil rights movement of that era, and was much more largely active in the South, though there were northern branches as well. And that Klan was highly fragmented. And there are many, many splinter groups, and that Klan was pretty much brought to its knees by the federal government, by the FBI in the 1970s. Okay, so three Klans, and we're going to go back to the first one. What was the Klan? What was the Ku Klux Klan? And as I'll tell you when I talk about its origins, the name means nothing. It's an invented name. It was the United States' first organized terrorist movement. It was organized, and it was a terrorist movement. There are still lingering ideas in some quarters in the United States that it was a movement dedicated to protecting Southern womanhood or Southern white safety against some imagined terrorism by Black freed people, which did not exist. That did not exist. These are myths. These are products of the lost cause mythology, which was congruent with the long Jim Crow era. Why is the story important? One, the Klan was a vast movement. It unquestionably had hundreds of thousands of members. In the state of North Carolina, where none of these numbers are completely provable, but in North Carolina alone, there were estimated to be about 40,000 members. In some in some counties of South Carolina, which are representative and highly documented, as much as 60, 70, and 80% of the white male population were members of the Klan. Nathan Bedford Forrest, not the founder of the Klan, we'll talk about that in a bit, but an early organizer of the Klan, its first Grand Wizard, claimed, although nothing he said is reliable, it should be said, but he claimed tens of thousands of members in his home state of Tennessee and hundreds of thousands across the South. I think certainly there were hundreds of thousands. Forrest was citing numbers like that to scare people, and they did scare people. It spread all over the former Confederate states, largely with the exception of Virginia. Why not Virginia, which certainly had a Klan movement in the 20th century? Because, in short, we can talk more about this later, Virginia was restored to white supremacist rule early, and the Klan was not perceived to be necessary. Terrorism wasn't perceived to be necessary. But it also spread into Kentucky, which was, as you all know, a border state and nominally a loyal state during the Civil War. And it's sometimes been said that Kentucky is the only state that became that joined the Confederacy after the war. And the Klan was extremely active there. There was no Klan activity whatsoever in any northern state. Why is this an important story? One, I said, is that it is the country's first organized terrorist movement. It was a massive movement, and it contributed to, or entirely of its own efforts, overthrew Reconstruction governments in many of the southern states. There's more to it than that, why Reconstruction ultimately fell short or failed, but the Klan's terrorism was a major factor in it. It changed history. Another way of looking at it, since I'm talking to people who are well-versed in the Civil War, is that we're accustomed to thinking that the war ended, whether you say basically with Appomattox or west of the Mississippi a month or 2 months later in 1865. And Robert E. Lee is sometimes, by some people, credited with preventing the waging of a guerrilla war after the war. The Klan movement was a guerrilla war. It was a guerrilla war. It was an extension of the Civil War by other means, rooted entirely in former Confederates who were self-proclaimed white supremacists. I'm not using that just as a present-day polemical term, but that's how they defined themselves. It was the term in which white members of the Klan and others took pride in the late 1860s. You should understand from my approach to this that Reconstruction did not fail because it was particularly corrupt. It wasn't. Was there corruption? Sure. Welcome to America in the Gilded Age. Yes, there was. Was it extraordinarily widespread? Not particularly. Was Reconstruction driven by zealots, ideological zealots in Congress, and by self-serving outsiders who were termed carpetbaggers in the South and scalawags in the years after the war? Did such people exist? I will not use the word carpetbagger or scalawag unless I have to, because these are slurs. They were slurs at the time. They're slurs today. They were meant to discredit, belittle, undermine the activities of people, most of whom were genuinely working to rebuild the South in a different way. Was that a way that was threatening to the old powers in the South, the slave-owning plutocracy? So I'm sure it was. It did threaten. Did the emancipation of 4 million formerly enslaved people threaten them? Yes, it did. Did it threaten them politically? Certainly it did. Did it threaten power structure? Yes, it did. Were people, white people, on the whole, threatened personally? Not particularly. Not particularly. Quite apart from anecdotal instances. The Ku Klux Klan had two objectives. One was to terrorize formerly enslaved people back into a state of subjection, whether it was called slavery or not, was to scare them out of public life and to scare them away from asserting themselves as individuals during Reconstruction. Two, and this is these two things are interrelated. The other goal was to destroy the Republican Party in the South, the embryonic Republican Party in the South. There was no Republican Party before the Civil War. It was founded in fits and starts locally all over the South, mostly among two groups. One, former Unionists, who of course had been suppressed during the Civil War, and many of whom became Republicans after the war. And that category of people also included here and there a significant number of former Confederates who decided that the war lost. The future of the country really did lie in rebuilding the South in a different, fairer, more democratic way. The other component of the Republican Party in the South, by far the larger one, was freed people, freed men. Of course, women were not invited to participate in politics. But states were able to enfranchise African Americans before the federal government did under the 15th Amendment. So you had African Americans, former slaves, and freed people as well, voting in virtually all the southern states before 1870 and the 15th Amendment. And you had African Americans participating in constitutional conventions in southern states, writing fair, democratic, small d democratic constitutions. And increasingly, African Americans are appointed to office by Republican office holders and winning elective office at every level. Initially, local justices of the peace, sheriffs, town council members, then state legislatures, and ultimately a number are elected to Congress and the Senate. So those are the targets of what becomes the Ku Klux Klan. I've said several times that the Klan was the country's first organized terrorist organization. If you'll permit me, I'm going to read just a short section from my book. It's right at the beginning in the preface. This is really the introduction to the book, and it describes something that occurred in Graham, North Carolina. That's the county seat of Alamance County, North Carolina, not too far from Greensboro in 1870. And this is a vignette of the Klan in action. It's what people are faced with. About 11 p.m. on February 26, 1870, the nighttime silence was broken by wild hallooing and the pounding of horses moving fast through the drizzly mist. Their riders wore white gowns and masks, and they surrounded the small frame house where Wyatt Outlaw lived with his small children and elderly mother. His last name was indeed Outlaw, which is a fairly common name in that part of North Carolina. 20 men burst into the house. They had great torches lighted, Jemima, Wyatt's mother, later told state officials. First, they came and threw the cover all off of me. Then they said to me, "Where is Wyatt?" One said, say. There were two who had swords, and there were pistols. One said, "Cut her head off." And another said, "Blow her brains out." They went out of that room, and as they passed, one says to the other, "Let's set the house afire." And as they went around to the room, I heard the little child cry, that's the baby, "Oh, daddy, oh, daddy." I ran and opened the door, and they were all around him, all around my son. He was putting on his pants, and I run back and got a stick and laid away as hard as I could. They jumped on me, they did, 3 of them, and stamped me, and I rose 3 times, and they knocked me down. And they stamped me, and I rose 3 times again, and they knocked me down. After that, they said, "God damn you, you strike a white man?" And they stamped me again 3 times on my head and my arms. And then I hallooed for murder, and they went off with him. They hollered like geese, and they went as hard as thunder riding. White Outlaw was about 57, sorry, he was about 50 years old that night, a light-skinned man of mixed race, a mulatto in the parlance of the time, with black wavy hair and beard, an earnest manner, and a notably bold, self-confident gaze. He had escaped slavery in 1864, made his way to Union lines, and enlisted in the cavalry, and served with it through the end of the Civil War and for a while thereafter. When he came home, he opened a woodworking shop where he repaired wagons and made coffins, and managed a sort of informal tavern where white and black working men gathered. He was counted among Graham's small black middle class and quickly gained a reputation among freed people as a man who knew things, who could speak with confidence, who could persuade a natural leader. In 1866, he had represented Alamance County at a statewide freedmen's convention. He was the local leader of the Union League, the organizing arm of the Republican Party, a founder of Graham's first AME church, an elected town commissioner, and he helped form an armed patrol of blacks and whites to protect against the rising threat of Ku Klux Klan violence. When others called for retaliation, White Outlaw counseled restraint, urging blacks to be as industrious as possible, give no cause for complaint, and trust in the law. Outlaw's captors dragged, pushed, and beat him half-dressed and barefoot a half-mile down Main Street to the courthouse at the center of town. They strung him up with a bed cord from the branch of an elm tree that reached toward the Italianate courthouse from which, for the past year, the Republicans had governed Graham. If Outlaw had any final words, no one recorded them. One of the Klansmen slashed his mouth with a knife, a last bit of pointed savagery toward a man who had too often spoken out for the rights that black men had been told by the national government and by North Carolina's embattled Republican governor were now theirs. His body dangled in front of the courthouse until the middle of the next day, when it was finally cut down by the sheriff, a former member of the Klan. The coroner ruled that Outlaw had died at the hands, quote, of persons unknown. Not long afterward, a black man named Per Year claimed to know who the murderers were. A few days later, Per Year was found floating dead in a pond. In the months that followed, without Outlaw's leadership, the Union League fell apart and frightened Republicans fled town. White Outlaw was but one victim, a grimly typical one of a movement that was sweeping the former Confederacy. Its targets were freed people and their white allies, who by their words or actions, however tacit, sought to transform the South from a region where power had been organized to protect the economic engine of slavery, and now the debasement of former slaves, into a democracy where black and white, rich and poor, had a place in the dynamic arena of politics. With the Confederacy's defeat in 1865, there was reason for hope. The South seemed poised for a racial revolution that would transform former slaves into free actors in national life and overthrow the white oligarchies that had ruled the slave states since the founding of the Republic. So that gives you an image, at least, of the Klan in action. So what was the Ku Klux Klan, really? What's its story? It was founded in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. That's about 80 miles south of Nashville. It's a small city, rather pleasant city, with a town square with a Confederate monument in the center. And if you're over there, it's got an excellent kind of old-fashioned local history museum in the public library. The origins of the Klan are quite well known. Why? Because several of the early members recorded them, quite proudly, as a matter of fact. The Klan was founded by about half a dozen men, young men, former Confederate veterans. They were all college graduates, quite well educated for the time. They were bored. Half the town had been burned in the course of the war. There wasn't much to do. And they sat around in a law office. The building is still there with a little plaque on it. The plaque, incidentally, in recent years has been turned backwards, which was a comment of the owner of the building about what he thought the Klan's founding there. For many, many years, the plaque rather celebrated the founding of the Klan. It doesn't anymore. Anyway, they hit on the idea of establishing some kind of fraternity to entertain themselves and entertain their friends. And they knocked around a bunch of names and they came up with this kind of crazy name, Ku Klux Klan. Why that? It sounded a little bit spooky. It sounded mysterious. And nobody had ever heard it before. And some of the other names that were knocked around were Giastiucus, the sons of Confucius, yet another one. And perhaps if one of those names had been chosen, the Klan never would have caught on. But at any rate, so initially it was kind of a boys' club, a young men's club anyway. They would dress up in weird outfits and parade around town, show up to surprise people at picnics and so on, and played banjos. It wasn't a terrorist organization at the beginning. It was, just as I've said, a kind of fraternity. But among their various entertainments was one that did catch on. And this was scaring Black people, freed people. Freed people made up about half the population of Pulaski, or the county anyway. And they didn't perpetrate violence at the beginning, but they did pull tricks or antics to scare Black people. And the idea of the Klan, this funky organization, spread through the county and a couple of neighboring counties. And the harassment of Black people inspired it to grow further. About 6 months later, this is in early 1867 in Nashville, there was the watershed meeting that founded the Klan as a terrorist group. That consisted of a number of former Confederate officers, senior officers, who established the Klan with a constitution. They called it a prescript. And it was from that point on a political organization dedicated, as I said, toward the repression of freed people and the destruction of the Republican Party. Initially, it existed just in Tennessee, but it would spread very quickly, particularly through the latter part of 1867, 1868, and 1869. Where does Nathan Bedford Forrest come in? As people deeply familiar with the Civil War, you of course know who Forrest was. And the off chance that there are people listening to this who don't, Nathan Bedford Forrest was, before the war, had been a very wealthy man. He made a fortune trading in slaves, trading in human beings, from his base in the city of Memphis. He was not illiterate. There were people accused him of being illiterate, but he was quasi-literate. And he craved respectability and importance, and his money made him an important man in Memphis, although not a wholly respected one, because even in the slaveholding South, slave trading was considered a rather low profession. During the war, he evolved into an extremely successful Confederate cavalry commander, brilliant in some ways, foolhardy in others, a great risk taker. Risks often paid off, as it turns out. A man who was most comfortable operating on his own with his brigade, often not so comfortable taking orders from men he didn't respect. He was also a war criminal. Many of you have heard, if there are some who haven't, I'll tell you about the Fort Pillow Massacre of 1864, which is extremely well documented. Fort Pillow is a fort a little bit north of Memphis on the Mississippi River. It existed to monitor security of traffic passing along the river. It was built by the Confederates at the beginning of the war, captured by the Union, and then held by a Union garrison. In 1864, the spring of 1864, that garrison was largely black, about 50-50 actually, between white, mostly Tennessee white Unionist troops and black troops. This was a fort with that was really oriented toward the river. If any of you have a chance to go there and visit it, you can see this today. It's a very, very interesting site. But it was very poorly defended on the landward side because nobody had expected an attack from the landward side. Bedford Forrest did attack it from the land. He overwhelmed the garrison and he butchered the black troops. The mortality among black soldiers was enormous, vastly in excess of normal casualties in a battle. They were shot down, unarmed, shot down. Some were burned to death. It was a barbaric massacre. Forrest boasted about it initially until he realized this was bad PR for the Confederacy, and then he became suddenly rather quiet about it, or pretended that something else had really taken place there. So that's Bedford Forrest's war. After the war, he was not able to get back on his feet economically. He has a couple of plantations, which are not doing very well. He tries one kind of investment, another. The investments don't do very well. He is recruited by his military friends to serve as the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Why? He was charismatic. He had a reputation for ruthlessness and total devotion to the Confederacy. It didn't hurt that he had been a trader in slaves. So what was Forrest's role in the Klan? I've said that the Klan metastasized. It spread very quickly, beginning in the latter part of 1867. It spreads first into Alabama. It spreads across Tennessee, as I said. There's evidence of it even in North Carolina, across the mountains, by early 1868. And its growth can't be attributed entirely to Forrest by any means. There were certainly individuals who, like sort of reactionary Johnny Appleseeds, traveled around and made contact with their wartime comrades and organized local dens or clans. Klan was very hierarchical in its original structure. That's to say, the Grand Wizard, you had statewide officers, and you had county-wide and town-wide officers. Over time, it became more and more decentralized, and the Tennessee group did not rule the Klan. Some state organizations were better organized, but by and large, it was a county-based organization, even though units, dens in different counties collaborated and cooperated each other to perpetrate terror en masse. So Forrest traveled around the South. His cover was as an executive of an insurance company. And wherever he alighted, new clans sprang up, and soon afterward, violence ensued. So Forrest bears a great deal of responsibility for spreading the Klan, for organizing the Klan, and also, I think, for shaping its tactics. So essentially, the Klan operated almost always, not always, always on horseback, and it operated like a force of guerrilla cavalrymen. That is, much the way Forrest's men operated when they could during the war. And for the larger context here, you may all have at some point in your lives absorbed the idea that the South was under military occupation, that there was a heavy-handed, massive military occupation of the former Confederate states. It's not true. In 1865, when the Federal Army began to be demobilized, there were about 1 million soldiers, federal soldiers. Numbers in the South were fairly large in 1865. The pressure to reduce the military and the military budget coming from Northern voters was enormous. The war had cost a fortune. The federal government almost went under 2 or 3 times during the war before it was able to raise enough tax money to pay for the army. So the pressure to reduce the army was huge, and it was reduced very, very rapidly. By 1868, across the entire South, the total federal military presence is 12,000 men, many of whom, a very large proportion of whom, are on the Texas frontier facing Indians. They are not a heavy-handed occupation force all over the South by any means. Where they are, and where they do exist, where there are bases, they're almost entirely either in state capitals or significant military, significant railway junctions. And there are almost entirely infantry. If you think about it, doesn't take a lot of thinking. It's pretty hard for infantrymen to catch men on horseback. This enabled the Klan to ride virtually without interference in 1867, 68, and into 69. The army is outmanned where there is an army at all. Much of the Klan's violence, its terrorism, is taking place in rural areas, and specifically in counties where the population of blacks and whites is relatively equally balanced. That's to say, where the population is heavily white, they don't need terrorism in order to drive blacks out of public life. And where in some areas, say the South Carolina coast, where the population of blacks is huge, there's a huge majority, there's no fertile ground for the Klan. So it's operating mostly in counties where the numbers are roughly balanced. You'll also, of course, know that the president from 1865 to March of 1869 was Andrew Johnson, a Tennessean, wartime, very strong wartime unionist, governor of Tennessee at the time, much admired because he did not join the secessionists in Tennessee. Lincoln, probably, very likely, in my opinion anyway, one of Lincoln's worst decisions as president was putting Andrew Johnson on the ticket in 1864. Andrew Johnson had no affinity for Black Americans. He opposed slavery because it undermined free white labor. But he was never an abolitionist. He had owned slaves. He freed them during the war. Nor did he support Reconstruction. He saw his future in politics as deriving from basically white Southern votes, former Confederate votes, and he was as eager as he could be to pardon former Confederates as quickly as possible, thereby alienating the Republicans who controlled Congress, and particularly the Republican radicals. Radical in those days meant specifically supporting civil rights, equal rights for former enslaved people, and vigorous Reconstruction. Okay, that's what radical meant. It's not doesn't have the same meaning as it does today. So there is a political war on Capitol Hill. I write quite a lot about this in my book. A political war taking place on Capitol Hill between Republicans in Congress and the White House a mile down the road in Washington, where I live, over the course of Reconstruction. But Johnson will not act to counter the Klan. He, like most Democrats including Northern Democrats, either pretends the Klan is not a serious organization, it doesn't exist, no matter what the evidence is of terror committed by the Klan, or if there is some terror, it's minor, it's all local. It's not a movement. Lest you have some doubts about that, it has been now the subject has been rigorously studied, and an excess of 2,000 people, the great majority African American, but also white Republicans, were murdered during those years, in excess of 2,000. The real number is undoubtedly much larger than that, because many people who were killed in out-of-the-way places, rural areas, in isolated incidents which are only vaguely were noted on the record. Others were simply not reported because people were afraid to report them. So it's a minimum of 2,000 people. And I will say at this point, I've used the word terrorism a lot, and I've had people challenge me about that word. Say, this is a present day word. It's an anachronism. We shouldn't be talking about terrorism. It is terrorism. The word was used at the time. A number of words were used, but terrorism was, in fact, it was probably coined to describe what the Klan was doing. I can't prove that it was coined, but I think it was. And the Klan's MO was something like this. Virtually everywhere it rode, it attacked people who were isolated and helpless for the most part. You may have those images in your mind from that film, Birth of a Nation, or even Gone with the Wind, which also romanticizes the Klan, of white Southerners behaving like knights of old and so on, and fighting armed men. They did not fight armed men. They fought undefended, typically helpless men and women and children. They perpetrated barbaric acts on people. Anything you've read about a present day terrorist organization in the Middle East perpetrating against innocent civilians, the Klan did in the United States in the 1860s and 70s. I'm not going to describe lurid things here. There's enough in my book. I try not to dwell excessively on it, but you have to know what the Klan was doing. They butchered people, they castrated people, they raped women, they performed really heinous sexual crimes against people. They killed children, they shot children, they raped girls. I'll leave it at that. Was that done in every instance? No. Was it done a lot? Yes, it was. And was it part of the norm of the Klan? Yes, it was. And I should say at this point, so who are the Klansmen? These are not the knights of old. But this is not an organization of just roughnecks and hooligans and criminals and so on, by any means. The Klan membership is made up largely, and in some areas virtually entirely, of otherwise respectable Southern white men. They include a lot of Civil War veterans, including officers, as I've already indicated, business people, members of so-called law enforcement who prefer not to enforce the law, but to break it, law enforcement, office holders, members of state legislatures sometimes, local office holders, journalists. A couple of the most prominent Klan leaders were journalists. In some instances, even ministers. And the Klan is full of educated people. If you read its prescript, you can read it in my book, or you can read it online. It's prescript, its constitution, laid out in Tennessee in 1866, 67. This was written by educated people who had a surprisingly wide knowledge even of classical history. Their choice of words, the language they use. This is not a screed written by illiterates. And uh, and I'll say another word here about documentation, because uh, if this story is new, and it is new to a lot of Americans, it was scrubbed out of our public memory during long years of Jim Crow and the ascendancy of the lost cause mythology. Um, uh, but the Klan's crimes are pretty well documented in several, other than local archives, of which there are many, and in some of which I've worked. The reports of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a federal agency that was set up to assist freed people in adapting to freedom, literally. It facilitated job training, civics education, built schools. Freed people flocked to schools, It's another myth that freed people were so ignorant and incompetent that they didn't deserve to be in government or to vote. Their enthusiasm for education was astonishing. And it's one reason the Klan burned schools, which it did everywhere, burned schools, freedmen's schools. Anyway, so documentation comes from people coming to Freedmen's Bureau officers and describing what had been done to them, what happened to their family members, who'd been killed. So, and those are abundant records. They're online now. Another source, which I used very heavily, is the investigation into the Klan carried out. It was the largest investigation of any subject in American history to date, carried out in 1871, by a joint committee of Congress. It included both Republicans and Democrats. Democrats who were hostile to the investigation were very active in trying to subvert it by calling witnesses who denied it, including known Klan members, Nathan Bedford Forrest among them, by the way. And that joint committee, with its subcommittees, traveled over most of the former Confederate states, interviewing freed people. The first time Black Americans were ever interviewed by a federal committee, including women. First time ever that women were ever witnesses before a federal committee. And they produced, in the end, 13 volumes. And I'll just show you one. It's not a very pretty volume, but these are online, by the way. 13 volumes, total of about 6,000 pages of testimony. And it's known as the Report of the Joint Select Committee to Inquire into the Condition of Affairs in the Late Insurrectionary States, otherwise known as the Ku Klux Klan Committee. Hundreds of people were interviewed, and people traveled often long distances to speak to the committee. They took their lives in their hands to testify, and some were killed for testifying. And for African Americans, it was often the first time that white people in authority ever bothered to ask them what was happening to them. The testimony is powerful. It's consistent from state to state to state to state. It's not coached. It's not scripted. It's an extraordinary document, a giant document of 13 volumes, I grant you, and be prepared for very, very, very small type if you read it. But you're hearing about Klan terrorism in real time from all kinds of people in all walks of life, including many white Southerners, white Republicans who themselves were targets of Klan violence. Some of it quite sadistic, but nonetheless survived. Others, office holders, and people who didn't really support the investigation. So it's quite diverse. It's quite diverse. So at any rate, so the word terrorism is inescapable. The violence that was the stock and trade of the Klan is inescapable. The vastness of the Klan movement is inescapable. So anyway, my book It's titled Klan War, Ulysses S. Grant and the Battle to Save Reconstruction. So Klan War has two dimensions. One, it's the war of the Klan against Reconstruction and against the fragile, newly founded biracial Republican Party in the South. But ultimately, the Klan War is the war waged by Ulysses Grant's administration against the Klan, which brought it down. Grant was elected in 1868. He takes office in March of 69. In the course of that year, between early 69 and late 1870, Grant, one, is learning how to be a president. As you all know, he was kind of a learn on the job president. He had been commander of the armies for several years, but that's a different job from being president, dealing with Congress, dealing with voters, dealing with political conflict and so on. He's not a natural politician. He's quite shy. He's a very sensitive man, quite remarkably sensitive for somebody who's made his life in the military. He is celebrated. He's charismatic because he led the Union to victory in the war. But he's a rather small, average-sized man with he's a little round-shouldered. He's quiet. He's not a great speaker. He's adequate. Very smart. He's a good writer, as you all know, those of you who've read his memoirs. He's a very good writer, but not a natural speaker. At any rate, among other things, he is receiving letters by the dozens and scores and hundreds from people in the South, from freed people, from Republicans who are begging for help. I'm going to take a moment here. I have a couple of very short excerpts from letters. And imagine Grant getting these every day in the White House. Charles Arnold, a postmaster in Georgia, is begging for protection. He wrote, quote, "Should I be murdered hereafter, I ask of your excellency the arrest and punishment of those men. If it were known that I had even written such a letter as this, I would be murdered instantaneously." That is very likely a black postmaster. Not clear from the letter, but another letter. A man named Woodruff wrote from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that there had been 26 murders in just a few months. Quote, "Kansas people are protected from Indian massacres. Why cannot we be protected against the Ku Klux outlaws?" Another letter. Sally Adkins of Georgia writes that her husband had just been murdered on a public road. Quote, "And the number of Negroes just dispatched is legion. His murderers are now at large openly. Nobody cares." And finally, when Klansmen couldn't find the men they sought, they often took vengeance on their wives and daughters. Just one example. Here's a woman in South Carolina. She writes that she was spat on and almost blinded by raiders who made her cook them a meal, then dragged her into the road and raped her. Klansmen nearby shot Amzie Rainey's small daughter, then gang raped another girl in front of Rainey's other children. And there's much worse than that. But at any rate, Grant is receiving these letters constantly. He's also receiving support reports from military in the South. Now, the military is not all of one piece. There are plenty of military officers, as I think many of you probably know, who are politically Democrats, and they were conservative on racial issues. They were, well, let's put it in plain terms, they were racist. They didn't have too much interest in assisting freed people. But the pressure builds on Grant. It builds from Congress. Grant is also persuaded by the information that he's receiving from the front, from these letters such as the ones I read to you. And at any rate, Grant's war against the Klan has two dimensions. It's based on law. It was not tyrannical. It was not Caesarism. He was accused of being a Julius Caesar as a military ruler, which he was not by any means. Congress, still controlled by Republicans, passes a set of force acts, spearheaded by the radicals, Republican radicals in Congress. They specifically target the Ku Klux Klan. They describe its activities. They describe things such as terrorizing individuals, going in disguise on a roadway, going in disguise armed, invading a house. And there are many gradations within these laws, but they circumscribe the activities of the Klan. So a crucial element in this is that Congress, in what was called the Ku Klux Klan Act, the third of those acts, specifically empowers the president to suspend habeas corpus in areas that are in a state of insurrection. That's the word that's used, insurrection. The Klan movement is described as insurrectionary. And suspending habeas corpus means that people could be held indefinitely and be tried by military tribunals, although in fact virtually none were. The federal judiciary was in fact remarkably scrupulous, bending over backward to operate according to law. At any rate, so there are two parts to this. One, there's the military component, which I think many people on this call will be particularly interested in. Grant sets out to make an example of upcountry South Carolina, which is one of the densest concentrations of Klan activity in the country. And habeas corpus is suspended in 9 counties, where there's an enormously high Klan membership. And to lead the increased federal forces in that area, the Army taps a man named Major Lewis Merrill, who is one of the heroes of my book. He's a remarkable guy. He's somebody we should all know about. He was a 37-year-old Civil War veteran. He was a West Point graduate, and he was a lawyer. Interesting combination. During the war, he had led a federal cavalry force against Confederate guerrillas in Missouri, which you all know was torn apart from end to end during the war. And he was very successful at that. He was the perfect man to lead the cavalry, and it was cavalry, against the Klan in South Carolina. Which cavalry was it? It was the 7th Cavalry. Yes, that's the same 7th Cavalry that would be largely destroyed, wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn, fighting the Sioux Indians a few years later. And some of these same soldiers who were serving in the South under Lewis Merrill died at the Little Bighorn. Why wasn't Custer there himself? Well, Custer was sitting with another part of the 7th Cavalry in Kentucky racing horses. He was a conservative Democrat, he was a racist, and he did not support Reconstruction. He didn't want any part of it. Lewis Merrill, at any rate, succeeded very rapidly in penetrating the Klan. He demonstrated what could be accomplished with political will and military force against an insurrection, a national insurrection. And he broke enough Klansmen to gain information about what the membership was, who was leading the Klan, what their plans were. And he worked the way good detectives do today to break a criminal organization, was to work from the ground up. The other component of the war against the Klan, what Merrill was doing in South Carolina was being done elsewhere as well, in other states where there are still these very, very fragile Republican governments that are on the brink of disintegrating because so many Black voters have been scared away from the polls. So at any rate, where the state is Republican and supportive, the Army is able to act pretty efficiently, but best of all in South Carolina. Merrill is operating with a partner. And that partner is the Attorney General of the United States, Amos Ackerman, a Georgia Republican, deeply religious, who is appalled by the terrorism of the Klan, and is personally overseeing the campaign against the Klan, their arrest and prosecution. In all, in South Carolina alone, this leads to the arrest of something like 5,000 individuals, 5,000 men. And some are sentenced to as long as 10 years in federal prison. As it happens, it's federal prison in Albany, New York, state prison, which was operated as a federal prison at the time. Many others to 1 or 2 or 3 years, and many more to fines. Was this adequate? Were these men, did they pay for their deeds? Not enough, not long enough. There's tremendous political pressure in Washington. Radical Republicans are losing power. Moderate Republicans are weakened. The Democrats, who oppose Reconstruction, win the House of Representatives in 1874. Money bills originate in the House. The Democratic-controlled House will not pay for the war against the Klan any longer. It will not pay for the number of prosecutors who are necessary. It will not pay for the troops. So from 1864 on, 74 on, the war is winding down. However, the Klan had waged its part of the war as cowards against unarmed people for the most part, and faced with the 7th Cavalry with carbine rifles, they caved. They widely informed on each other, and prosecutions continued sufficiently long and with enough people sufficiently sentenced that the Klan was brought to its knees as an organization. Were there acts of terrorism after that? Yes, there were. But did the mass movement continue to exist? No, it did not. Another pertinent fact here is that politics changed in the United States in 1876, the election of 1876. Grant was leaving office. He wasn't going to run for a 3rd term. And as I said a few minutes ago, the influence of radicals in the Republican Party had dramatically diminished. And the Republican Party is shifting its eyes away from the South. Voters in the North are sick of the South. They're sick of hearing about the South, sick of hearing about its problems, frankly, sick of being asked to protect Black people in the South. You cannot separate this history from ingrained saturation level racism in the United States. It's regrettable. It's the way it was, and it would continue. And after the election of 1876, an agreement, some of it tacit, some of it explicit, is cut between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans will be allowed to retain control in a few southern states a little bit longer, and the federal government will call its troops back to its barracks. So it's not quite truthful to say that the federal army was pulled out of the South everywhere, but the troops, many were, the rest returned to barracks. And Reconstruction as a forceful operation was ended by 1877. Many Blacks remained as office holders in areas where there were enough Black voters to elect them for years afterward, until the turn of the 20th century, but their numbers steadily diminished and their influence, even within the Republican Party, shrank. So I think it's time for me to bring this to an end. And I'll be happy to answer questions in a few minutes, but I want to leave you with a very short quotation from W.E.B. Du Bois, the eminent historian, Black historian, who wrote the first great history of Reconstruction, titled Black Reconstruction, in 1935. And he wrote, one is astonished in the study of history at the recurrence of the idea that evil must be forgotten, distorted, and skimmed over. The difficulty, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive, an example. It paints perfect men and noble nations, but it does not tell the truth. He added, if we are going to use history for our pleasure and amusement, for inflating our national ego and giving us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment, then we must give up the idea of history either as a science or as an art. And in a sense, what I just read you is the rationale behind my book, Klan War. And we have to know this history. It's not a pretty history. It's very mixed. It's bitter in some respects. It's very ugly in some other respects. But we need to know the truth of what happened. There's no point in sugarcoating it or pretending it didn't really exist. It didn't really happen. And I mean, the honor in this history goes to men like Grant, Lewis Merrill, Amos Ackerman, and others whom I haven't had time to mention. So this is not entirely a dark and desperate story, but there is darkness and desperation in it. So now I'll be happy to take any questions there are. Thank you.